All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you, man. It's always a pleasure, and I'm very pleased you invited me to participate once again.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming out. I always enjoy our conversations, and this one's I guess I'm particularly interested in this topic. So, what I want to talk to you today is essentially you've described yourself as a right Hegelian. And so I think a lot of people on the right associate Hegel very much with kind of like Marxist thought. But before we get into that, could you give just a brief description of who Hegel was and why he was important?
I mean, Hegel was, if anybody who's got any kind of root, I don't know what universities basically teach in terms of philosophy these days, like what their introductory curriculum was. And even 20, 30 years ago, I went to a Jesuit college in the big city, which might seem weird to people, owing to my own confessional heritage, but um, it's where I went to Loyola University, and they had a peculiar emphasis on political philosophy, and they're in those days their philosophy and political science department were very theory based and did not have a Jesuit or liberal orientation. That may be different now, but in any event, so even then I didn't have a great grasp of what they of what kind of Big Ten colleges taught people in terms of philosophy. But what I've gleaned just kind of from perusing the syllabi of philosophy courses and things, and from what people had told me, kind of young and old, um, they kind of present the distinction between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, somewhat derisively, I think. Okay, but um, that doesn't need to be the case. There's nothing inherently punitive about describing continental philosophy in contrast to rationalist empiricism and things like that, and what have you. And there's more interrelatedness in terms of intellectual foundation than most people will allow. But if you want to know who the true father of quote continental philosophy is, as we perceive it, it's Hegel. Okay, um, and the degree to which German idealism kind of created the basic European philosophy is all in dialogue with Aristotle and German idealism. Okay, that's a little bit outside the scope. And I'm not any kind of expert on Aristotle. I mean, most of what I know of Aristotle, I mean, obviously, like I've read, the Nicomachean Ethics and the politics and things, and I've studied that extensively, but I don't have fluency in Greek. So that's one barrier. But also, I mean, my kind of area of focus is, the modern era. So I I mostly came to the Aristotle and the classics, as well as the pre-Socratics, through thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Hegel, Kierkegaard, people like this. But in any event, to bring it back, um, continental philosophy. I mean, today it's philosophy is it doesn't need to be this way, but traditional philosophy is somewhat dead. Although I'd argue that a lot of a lot of the kind of newer sciences, like neuroscience and things, specifically like the science of mind, um, versus just the study of the physical brain. I mean that very much that very much spills over into the territory of philosophy. Okay, inevitably, and it ends up having a philosophical discussion in kind of conventional terms, whether that's the intention or not. So I mean, you do find continental philosophy insinuated into modern academic discourse, but it's in somewhat accidental ways. Okay, but at the same time, there's a lot written uh, in critical capacities, positively and negatively, about philosophy. There's a huge amount of stuff published on that, um, and which is good. I mean, it's good people are still reading these things. It's unfortunate, again, that there's not a lot of original work that kind of unqualifiedly calls itself philosophy. But regardless, all that scholarship that I just described, it's all basically in dialogue with Hegel. Okay, in to some degree or another. Okay, so I mean that's whether people realize it or not. Anybody who's kind of intellectually engaged with these sorts of thought paradigms this kind of intellectual history and heritage, they're engaged with Hegel. And if they haven't studied the original source documents by the man himself, if they were to do so, they'd come to realize, like, oh wow, they'd recognize the concepts that they've been in dialogue with pretty much for the entirety of their sort of academic career. So that's something to keep in mind. In more concrete terms, the 20th century was the Hegelian century, okay, in a very real sense, but for peculiar capacities. I can't remember who it was, and I don't think it's early onset dementia. It's just that my memory fails me sometimes with names, but it may have been Louis Ferdinand Céline, the French, the kind of French transgressive philosophic novelist. It might have been him, but if I'm wrong, I mean, I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments or whatever. Said that the Battle of Stalingrad was where right and left Hegelians met, to settle their differences once and for all. And I mean, he intended it as kind of gallows humor, but that actually was correct, okay? And there's a peculiar thing in Marxism, because dialectical materialism turns Hegelianism on its head. I think of the relationship of Marx to Hegel is kind of like the relationship of Carl Schmitt to Hobbes, okay? And people are familiar with both, will understand where I'm going with that. But Marxism really kind of rejected the core. It kind of it adopted a Hegelian methodology in a sense, but that postulated the opposite cause as the prime moving force of history, which is really strange. And it's further complicated by the fact that originally the quote left Hegelians were guys like David Strauss, were these kind of liberal theologians, who were very much concerned with, removing reference to and they viewed kind of they viewed their opposition, kind of the Prussian apologists for the Prussian state. They viewed them, as basically appealing to the absolute, and to the and to biblical authority, and and supernatural causes, in order to kind of shut down arguments that force them to kind of rationalize why they posited that the state represented the kind of concrete zenith of an ideal that brought about by centuries of dialectic. But the guys like Strauss, I mean, he was liberal in, like, the kind of the 19th century sense, okay? Like, he wasn't, and he had heterodox views of Christ and things, but these guys had nothing in common with Marxists or anything. So then later so when Marxism kind of came into its own, and became this huge animating force in this kind of incredibly powerful movement, Marxists became viewed as the quote left Hegelians, and these guys like Strauss became referred to as the quote young Hegelians. So I mean, this is all very convoluted, but I guess my point is that in a very strange way, like Marxism is kind of a peculiar. I mean, a right Hegelian would view Marxism as kind of this like deviant offshoot of the dialectical process itself. That's like purposefully contrarian, but nevertheless, owes its origins to the dialectical process that is the prime moving agent of history. Marxists themselves, like, calling them quote left Hegelians is peculiar, because again, they cite dialectical materialism and these kind of determinative, physical, literally like determinative physical processes of labor and production and techniques, and man's relationship to these things as being what shapes man's conceptual horizon, as well as driving the historical process. So I mean, it's very, very strange. But essentially, if you're a traditionalist Hegelian, in terms of your you're centered on the absolute, as the source of ultimate reality, and you basically accept like Hegel's postulates about the nature of mind um, versus the nature of concrete reality, and the interplay between both domains. And if you accept that, if you accept the perspective that the dialectical process ultimately perfects its progress towards the ideal that is inspires it in the first place. um that if you accept that perspective, by default you're considered a right Hegelian. I mean, I refer to myself that way because I'm not. I think the right left paradigm doesn't hold a whole lot of meaning in the 21st century, but just for in the interest of coherence and and clarity. I mean, that people understand what we're talking about in familiar terms when we say right versus left, because if nothing else, it describes basically a series of a set of values and preferences, ethical, aesthetic, and otherwise, in a certain historical perspective. So I mean, I don't run from it when people say that I'm right wing, but it's not. I don't have some discrete kind of take on Hegel. It's that I'm literally a right wing writer and revisionist who's also a Hegelian. So, and kind of by default, because I don't ascribe to this, I don't ascribe to this kind of critical theology perspective of people like Strauss, not Leo Strauss, David Strauss, for clarity. And obviously I'm not any kind of Marxist. Like by default, that makes me a quote right Hegelian as well. So I realize I was long winded, but it's a dense topic. That's what I
No,
mean.
not at all. So for the sake of clarity, do you think you could do kind of like a quick, like kind of verbal Venn diagram of right and left wing Hegelians? So for instance, like what do they share and where do they, I guess, differ? I think I obviously I could tell in the last I guess your last kind of series of statements, but it might be easier to just kind of get it out explicitly and kind of quickly so people can follow along, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, the left Hegelians, if we're talking about Marxists again, um, their view is that the primary movement in history is productive force determinism. Okay, literally material processes and man's relationship to these processes. In the ongoing and the ongoing struggle to kind of release man from labor, and the subsequent interplay between owners and laborers, and you know and labor and capital itself, and how technology impacts these things. That is literally the what facilitates the historical process. Okay, in contrast, right Hegelians or traditional Hegelians, again, like they believe that they believe very fundamentally in the absolute. They believe that processes of mind um are is the prime movement in history, and the dialectical processes intrinsic to mind um in uh in service of and in relationship to the ideal um is what is what is what facilitates the historical process, and is what allows man to comprehend it conceptually. Okay, so these are these are radically opposing viewpoints, and again, it's a peculiar kind of fact of history, and kind of of the limits of language. Again, that Marxists became identified as left Hegelians, when in reality they basically reject Hegel's paradigm outright. And again, like I said, the initial kind of dissenter Hegelians of the left were people like David Strauss, and people people who are God-centric in a way, because most of them are theologians, including Strauss himself. That's mostly what he's known for. But they had a very critical view of reference to the absolute in in historical processes because they believe that it was just a way again of kind of a way of winning arguments, for lack of a better way to describe it, without having to resort to the rigorous process of truly rationalizing their perspective. That's not to say they went quite as far as these like charlatans like Karl Popper or something, who invoke the scientific method as some kind of as some kind of end all process by which history can be interpreted, and of which values must be subjected if they were to be accepted as correct or valid. I mean, it was nothing like that. It was nothing crankish, but it did very much owe to kind of the bias towards materialism of the 19th century. And I mean, that can't be denied. So I mean, that's in very basic terms. That's the way to understand it.
It's odd because I noticed that kind of like that thread of left-wing Hegelianism and kind of the conversation of people you'd even think who would be kind of opposed to it, right? So actually, just a few hours before I typed this up for you, I was coming back from the backwoods of northern Maine, where I have a friend up there, and I ended up taking a variety of planes, trains, and then I drove the last few hours with a friend, and it was interesting because I talked with her, and she's of a similar confessional history to you and I, but it's kind of been absorbed into like the DC laptop class, right? And so it's odd because we were talking and the topic of historiography came up.
Mm-hmm.
And she was, despite being, kind of a Calvinist tradition, was absolutely and totally convinced that essentially the world operated purely along the lines of, dialectical materialism. And I was kind of I was a little bit shocked by that, not because I hadn't heard the ideas before, right? But just it was a very odd, I guess, it was very an odd preconception for someone to have, with a certain background and with a certain set of ideas. And to me, it's odd too, because on one hand, it's like what you said, right? Like on one hand, Hegel is, kind of dense and difficult to read, and not many people actually like engage with him directly. But at the same time, he does kind of form the bedrock of so much of kind of second order political discussion, if that makes any sense. And so it's interesting to me because I had been, and maybe this is being raised by kind of like, baby boomer neocon types, but very much it was like, oh, like Hegel's what Marxists read. Like you don't like Hegel. You're not supposed to read Hegel because Hegelianism is essentially like the bedrock of like pinko commies, right? And so it's odd to me. Sorry, carry on.
No, it's very weird. And I think part of that's purposeful misunderstanding by some people because again they've got contempt for continental philosophy because they view it as at worst like a kind of primitive mysticism, and at best they they view it as kind of intellectual gobbledygook. I mean, both of which are profoundly ignorant viewpoints. But I mean, there is an anti-intellectual strain in America, like not in a way that like these kinds of like midwit NPR losers claim, who because like they're the most kind of pitiable like striverish like midwits of all, but they fancy themselves as educated. But I mean, genuinely, if Americans really don't, even like a lot of like even like a lot of churchmen I respect, like in my own confessional heritage, they'll read Institutes to Christian Religion, and they'll read Aristotle and they'll read scripture, obviously, but beyond that, they don't really read philosophy. And you get guys to you get guys like IR theorists and things and kind of political sociologists and things. I realize these days those disciplines are like a joke in terms of the people that they attract, but during the Cold War they were not, and you still have some guys who are pretty prominently situated in those disciplines who are serious people, but they kind of purposefully avoid reference to continental philosophy because it's viewed as like this faux pas or like something to be something to be shunned, or at least not referred to within within the four corners of their research. So there's that. And yeah, but I mean beyond that, it's just a strange thing that like I said, that Hegel became so identified with the left, because I mean again, this is something that this itself is like a Hegelian process. I mean, which is kind of fascinating. But anybody, I know that a lot of younger guys read Carl Schmitt, and that's great because Schmitt's very important. Okay, and I think he's particularly because, I mean, maybe it's because like I was a lawyer, I've got a bias for inductive reasoning. So Schmitt, I find him kind of relatable in conceptual terms. That's kind of the way my mind works anyway in attacking problems. But anybody who's read him extensively, particularly read Nomos of the Earth, and understands his concept of political theology, and also has a deep understanding of Leviathan by Hobbes. The relationship of Marx to Hegel is very, very, very much like the relationship of Schmitt to Hobbes. Okay, Schmitt basically rejects all of Hobbes' ontological postulates and turns it on its head. Yet he retains he retains and is totally in agreement with Hobbes' view of what sovereign authority represents, particularly in symbolic psychological terms. It's really kind of fascinating. Like obviously Schmitt was a far more rigorous thinker than Karl Marx. And Marx was a weird thinker. That's part of it, and so was Engels. I think Engels was a bit more disciplined. But these guys were not economists, and Marxism is not economics. That's why, I mean, obviously you don't really find them anymore, other than some like weird fossils at probably Berkeley or whatever. But throughout the entirety of the Cold War, you had in economics departments at big universities, you had like quote Marxist economists. Like Marxism is not economics. It's this weird theory of it's this weird sociological theory, and it's this kind of grand theory of reductionist theory of history, that relies upon postulates that are kind of self-referencing, and a kind of speculative deduction, about the human condition in the modern age. But it's the claim that it's some kind of like economic methodology is absurd, because it's not at all.
Well, I very much agree with you. And it's interesting, right? Because being a younger guy kind of interested in these things, you're kind of drinking from a fire hose, right? Like in order to kind of catch up to the conversation, you have to read quite a lot pretty quickly. And it's interesting because Marxists describe themselves as kind of, like you said, like economic and scientific. And look, like I have a certain amount of econ background. I don't like stay up at night thinking about econ, but I've read a decent amount of it.
Sure.
And fair enough, maybe econ isn't a true hard science. That's a separate conversation. But you read Marx and it's it's very much like you said. It's kind of this like self-referential, like I guess like not like logic puzzle, but kind of like thought experiment. That seems to be particularly attractive to a certain type of person. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing in Marx or that Marx was like, a mouth-breathing moron. But it is nowhere near as, I guess, like scientific or I guess like not rationalistic, but I guess like experimental as it kind of presents itself.
Well, yeah, and that itself is a conceptual bias. It's like Kerry Mullis said, and I think about Kerry Mullis a lot, owing, of course, to the COVID situation and other things. But like Mullis pointed out, like the one of the big one of kind of the big lies or big blind spots, rather, in some people's cases, of the 19th and 20th centuries was this idea that like that quote unquote science is something you believe in, or that or that it's like, or that it's this value laden perspective, or that it's some kind of like absolute means of revealing some sort of higher truth. Like all science is a methodology. It's not something you believe in. Like you don't. That's like saying you like believe in metallurgy or something. Like you don't. So this idea, that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons why, like, when I hear these people, whether it's these bizarre freaks in public life or whether it's kind of midwit infotainment consumers, talk about quote trust the science. It's like that's kind of that's kind of cranked 19th century thinking. Like you won't think that way anymore. You're not really part of the conversation, if as it were, if you think in those terms. And that's one of the reasons. Yeah, that's one of the reasons Marxism and Leninism later on, even until the 1980s, it was singularly obsessed with talking about how its postulates are quote scientific. I mean, like even if that was the case, like so what? I mean, like that means nothing. Like unless your goal is like build a bridge or to like fire a or invent gunpowder or to like make an automobile run or like launch a rocket into space. Like it means nothing to me if you're quote invoking science. Like I mean, what does that even mean? Like in a political ethical capacity. Like nobody can explain that.
Well,
But
it's actually it's part of the reason that I have and I realize this doesn't mean much coming from an anonymous 23-year-old on the internet, but I kind of have an objection with the idea of political science for that reason.
yeah,
Right? The ruling men is not necessarily scientific in the same way that ruling a bridge is. Right? Like, okay, there are some societies that are better than others on certain objective factors. But the idea that like, oh, well, if we just add, 3% of this or 3% of that, we will increase kind of like happiness by a factor of 5, something dumb like that. And the reason I say this is because I have a somewhat strained relationship with a friend of mine who is kind of like a CIA, or not a CIA, he's a State Department spook, essentially, political scientist. And it's always interesting talking to him because he will quite often, and I say this as someone like, this is not a moral claim on his personal character. It's just kind of a claim on how he talks, right? But he'll oftentimes like refer to things like human rights in kind of objective terms. Like the idea that you can kind of measure something is like odd and subjective as that. And don't get me wrong, like if you gave me a choice between living in America and, North Korea, that's a pretty easy choice. And maybe you can say, okay, that's human rights. So I'm not trying to be as reductive as that, but it is odd, this idea that like, well, we can kind of use subjective measurements and kind of turn these into numbers and plug them into spreadsheets.
Well, it's also like you can't have it both ways. Like quote human rights. Only yes, that's a natural law claim. But the people who who invoke it and aim to advance it reject natural law postulates. So it's like so it's like what are you talking about? Like what is a quote right then? Like it doesn't make any sense. And this idea that I agree with Douglas McGregor that and other. I mean, I agree with Friend Yaki, frankly, but I mean, in terms of people who are in terms of contemporary polemicists, who have been insinuated into the regime and now are critical of it. It's not some crank idea or conspiratorial to point out that the regime today it owes more to people like Trotsky than it does John Locke or Thomas Paine. Yeah, and especially the State Department's positively deranged. Like there really is these kind of it's these people who come off like these kinds of deluded, disengaged apparatchiks in the final days of the Soviet Union who are just like invoking this kind of gobbledygook language that didn't move anybody anymore and that seemed like outdated even as they were uttering it. Like sitting down and saying like, you're going to slate this society for annihilation and you're going to sanction these people and you're going to do this and you're going to move this population around. And it's like, because quote unquote, human rights demand it. And, we're progressing towards some telluric utopia that is going to be, facilitated once we make men more governable and suited to government. Like that's a bizarre idea in all kinds of ways and doesn't really make any sense. But it's also that's an idea that belongs to 1920. It's a century out of date. And that's one of the reasons this people sound so weird. And like I pointed out to these types before, I spent some time in Washington D.C. Around like 2005, and that was kind of at the zenith of the second sort of neocon renaissance. I'd point this out to people like over cocktails who were very insinuating of that culture. And it's like it didn't compute. Like they'd give me some kind of like moronic look, pause, and then like keep going. It's like you can't. It's like in Cool and Luke, like some men you just can't reach. Like I'm not suggesting your friend is like this. I mean, I speculate he's a lot more. There's a lot more depth. Otherwise, somebody like you wouldn't associate with him. But yeah, it's true. It's bizarre. It's like there's not. It's like these people have been kind of trained. They're kind of like trained seal, or they're kind of like trained parrots, but they're not. They don't have any. They don't have any meaningful understanding of the words that they utter. It's like these things aren't even platitudes. It's like they don't. They're not capable of unpacking what the actual meaning is of these things. It's just they've kind of committed it to memory and by repeating it over and over, like a script, like that's kind of helped them get insinuated into whatever sort of career role they want. And it's really that simple and that simple-minded, I think.
Well, and to me, I feel like there's few better like crystallized versions of this. This is one of those famous, at least I think, like kind of famous moment in American politics, right? And it's that interview of Madison Albright in what, 05 or 06, where the reporter says, well, okay, is it true that, 500,000 Iraqi children died? She's like, oh yeah, well it is. And the reporter asks, well, is it worth it? And she just stone cold looks in the camera and says, yes, it was worth it. And that's kind of psychotic, right? The idea that you're in the pursuit of human rights, which is, like we've said before, it's kind of ill-defined, but you would assume that child murder is probably something a human rights centric regime would not countenance, right?
No, it's also, yeah. And it's also too, I mean, what I will say about, the Soviet Union was strange in all kinds of ways, but one of the reasons it was dangerous, like I'm not some arch cold warrior type, in terms of my historical perspective. I'm not sitting here saying like, oh, Ivan was so dangerous, but I mean, the Soviet Union was a highly lethal superpower, and it had a tremendous power projection capability. But even it's the apparatchiks who are situated in powerful roles. They were fundamentally serious guys, and there was a remarkable consistency to them. I mean, yeah, okay, Marxist-Leninism is nonsense, and it's characterized by gobbledygook. Doesn't really mean anything, but they had a very, very deep understanding of their own perspective. Like, in addition to being just like a very bad person, to your point, Madeleine Albright was she was like a fucking moron. Like these people are like it's incredible the kind of obtuse ignorance of these people. Like somebody like her, like to your point, like she didn't even realize like what's wrong with that statement. Like I don't even mean like in ethical moral terms. I mean she didn't even realize like what the inconsistency is. It's like, it's like you said, it's like so you annihilated 500,000 people, many of whom were minor children and the elderly, to advance, human rights and alleviate suffering. They'll like nod and be like, oh yes, of course. Like it doesn't compute like what's wrong with that. That's I made the point before, and I'm sure people get tired of it because it seems like I'm just like some like angry old guy like beating a dead horse. But the degree to which the government became totally bizarre, crazy, freakish, and clownish, like very suddenly, and like in 1993, it was jarring. And it's like I mean, I guess that was always waiting in the wings, and it was just necessity that dictated that you have a serious regime in place, because when there truly was a possibility of Armageddon, that was kind of always in the wings, and about every decade, strategic conditions kind of broke down, or the kind of the balance of the kind of containing balance broke down, and about every decade, like 53, 62, 73, and 83. And the world really did come close to nuclear war. I mean, you can't have literal clowns like Madeleine Albright and like these piggy kind of perverts like Bill Clinton in executive roles. If at any moment the civilization might be under threat owing to general nuclear war. So I mean, it makes sense that happened, because the regime as it had existed since 1933 essentially put itself out of business. Okay, but the rapidity with which these fools were kind of catapulted into prominent roles, like I found it shocking then, and I still kind of find it surprising. But yeah, it's particularly, and that's what's weird I mean, especially with the State Department is the worst of. I mean, they're kind of the most abjectly cretinous of all of any kind of branch of the regime, as far as I can tell. But it's the weird disconnect is that, I mean, like I pointed out to people, for better or worse, and people's motivations certainly not pure in arguing on either side of this issue, but until the Clinton administration, there was a real tension between people in the establishment who opposed military action kind of categorically, and people had like a hawkish perspective. After the Cold War, I mean, part of this was because the military establishment like had to find a reason to continue to exist. So they kind of availed themselves under Clinton as like the kind of corpse manufacture division of woke capital, as it were. But the degree to which these people, the degree to which the degree to which these like regime loyal people think nothing of the fact, just kind of like endless unprovoked military violence against the world's populations, is totally insane. And so, to your point, it's sociopathic. Like these people, they'll find like trembling rages if you suggest that maybe like man on man sodomy is not like a sacrament, but they think nothing of like killing 500,000 kids, or like they're slating the Russian Federation and its people for destruction, or or waging just like a perennial war on Dar al Islam, owing to some unconditional fealty to a Zionist apartheid state. Like it's totally insane. And but I mean, again, it's like Michael Jones is always saying, it's morality is an all or nothing proposition. You can't like abandon reason and say like, oh, like abortion is great, like sodomy is a sacrament, and embrace kind of all these like sociopathic perspectives, but then retain some kind of like respect for human life, or some sort of aversion to murdering your fellow man for no good reason. So I didn't mean to turn that into a polemical rant, but
No, not at all. And it's interesting to me because, and this kind of neatly ties back in with our like why I kind of reject like the hyper materialist view of history. And you see this coming both from kind of traditional left wingers and also from a lot of people in kind of like the libertarian sphere, where a lot of guys on our side of things kind of pass through.
yeah.
But it's this idea that you kind of look around at, let's just say, them, whoever them is, you can kind of plug in your own them. And you're like, well, okay, like, why are they doing this? Because there's certain things that just don't make sense. And if your perspective is limited to pure materialism, right? Like people in power do what they do to increase their own, I guess, like monetary gain. You kind of come up a little bit short. You're like, well, okay, why? Because like people like Bill Gates, right? Like he gives away a lot of money and he has more money than he can really spend. But why does he keep doing things? It's probably not to make more money. And you kind of come around to, well, they must be possessed, either ideologically or maybe like on some other level, right? But there really is this kind of like, I don't know what to describe it, but this like kind of disturbing ideological, like genocidal surety, right? This idea that like I know exactly how to remake man, to create a new type of person who can be kind of governed better. And if it's 500,000 children, if it's the destruction of the world economy, it doesn't matter, right? We'll get there eventually. And to me, I don't know what you call that, but I see it in, I guess, a lot of kind of like the upper class and like the striving class now. And maybe it's a human constant, I'm not sure, but it does seem very odd. And the way you describe the like, I guess like the reorganizing of kind of like the US government along very like non-serious lines, to me, it just at a certain level, I still have a hard time believing that you can be kind of a head of state and so disconnected from reality, but maybe that's a little bit naive.
Well, I mean, there is even the deep state isn't just a kind of crazy Donald Trump concept or some talking point. I mean, it's like a real thing, and it's and it's not even necessarily always insidious. I mean, it's just a function of the managerial regime. You can't have any modern government. Um, from from the 20th century onward, really, you can't like government can't function without discrete cadres of experts. And there's also choke points where the rubber meets the road in terms of functional policy, wherein it's just not possible for one man to be at the helm of these things, or for some or for some quorum of elected officialdom, to be directly managing these functions. I mean, that's just the way it is. That it's a sociological and structural reality. So I mean, there's that. But it's also if you're gonna have a media driven culture, and if you're gonna be committed to this kind of bizarre social engineering project, you're gonna basically have like a two-tiered kind of elite. You're gonna have like you're gonna have kind of like the public relations department, which is the people who hold formal office. And then you're gonna have like the actual functionaries, you know, who uh, who run the government. I made the point before that places like the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, they're not particularly free societies. Um, they're not particularly well-run societies in a lot of ways, but they are transparent. Like the Russian Federation, there's not guys like Medvedev and Mr. Putin, behind the scenes, kind of running the government. While you have these like bizarre actors and kind of like career PR guys, like who they pretend are like running the country. Like only America and the UK does that, and kind of like some of the more prominent EU states. But even that, a state like the Bundesrepublic has no sovereignty because it's under permanent occupation. But the German chancellor is basically the head of government. It's not that's not a fake or something. But so yeah, there's that. That's how things can continue to function. But it's also a key thing to understand too is like I said, there's the Westphalian state is going to continue to exist for some time, although I believe it's on its way out. But the government is structured since 1933. Again, it's not really tailored to do anything. It's tailored to do two things. It's tailored to take on these kinds of mass social engineering projects, which in the case of this country, it's an incredibly destructive prospect, considering what its goals are. Which is basically to eradicate any organic sources of identity and communitarian association and all of that. But its other thing is it's basically tailored to fight the Cold War and not much else. That's this touches and concerns everything, including the kind of recent COVID foolishness. It's you've got this regime that no longer has a raison d'etre, so it's just perpetually kind of seeking out, confabulating, quote unquote emergencies to manage, because it's not really structured to do anything else. So that's an important thing to consider too, in terms of the kind of peculiar dysfunction of our regime, or not ours, but the regime, within the country in which we live. It's just and it's I think there is a in terms of why people abide its violence, figurative and literal. I think considering that Americans aren't particularly intellectually inclined, and they don't they don't seek out answers to historical questions and quagmires in any meaningful way. Most people don't. But what they do is, one of the reasons the people bizarre about the Supreme Court. I made the point before that it's bizarre that Americans view it as this kind of like rabbinic council. Like people really do. I mean, to invoke Carl Schmitt again, they really do view government, particularly in America, where you're in this kind of a where the people are regime loyal, or these kind of you know ahistorical, deracinated people who don't really understand the source of morals and authority and things. They really do view the government, it is their stand-in for God. The Supreme Court really is this kind of like this kind of like high council of rabbis or priests or something, and its declaratory judgments, really are really do have the force of like a hadith or something, and they really do view government action as a literally miraculous occurrence, and they really do view like officialdom as uh as some as some kind of entity that warrants your kind of like you're kind of like odd fealty. I mean, that's a completely alien concept to me. Like, not because I'm so great or so smart, but because the idea that anybody even I realize like human psychology is highly symbolic, but the fact that anybody could look at the current regime as anything other than this kind of bizarre um failing, entirely worldly apparatus is kind of incredible to me. But then again, I'm not really I'm not really a normal kind of citizen, and I'm not really insinuated into things like that. It's not like I work a 9 to 5 job or something, or like I got kids in public school. It's not like it's not like I've got some sort of stake in in the system, because I really don't. But
It's to me, it reminds me of, and I can't remember if this is in the first or the second conversation we had. Maybe it was the first one, the one about Protestantism. But it reminds me very much of kind of the idea that your relationship with God is your kind of template for your relationship with authority, right? And so I realize when talking about a rabbinic council, this is somewhat of a delicate conversation for you two,
yeah,
right? But I think that we can track the difference in kind of theological, I guess, like persuasion and also like relationship with government. And I say this even as like someone who realizes that the vast majority of people probably don't think very much about theology at all. Even if they kind of don't necessarily have an explicit relationship with God, I think that there is kind of like a concept of, I
oh
guess,
yeah,
like highest authority they integrate with.
no, that's what I meant. And when I say that, like, when I say that all political authority is conceptually theological, like, I don't mean that your average man or woman in the street, is thinking about this in heavy terms. Like, I mean, in symbolic psychological terms, instinctively, that's where their mind goes, and that's why they respond to officialdom the way that they do. That's a constant, and that's like I said, that's kind of what Schmitt took from Hobbes, while turning his ontology like on its head. But yeah, you're right. It's just it's just weird to it's just but I mean I get in some ways in some people are pretty malleable, and I think the kind of uh the kind of mediocre middle, kind of, as it were, they, at least in this country, because frankly I don't what the Germans would call mention material is not particularly quality here. Those people can be molded pretty effectively. But at the same time, you know, in my lifetime and in earnest in the last 10 years, the people who are not susceptible to that sort of social engineering, and the people who are capable of a sovereign existence. In the terms Ernst Younger talked about such things, a sovereign person. Um, people like us and like you and myself included, like, people have become, radicalized, and they've, been motivated to secede as much as possible from the regime and do whatever they can within the law, because we don't advocate breaking the law, to expedite its demise. And that means that the kind of racial immune system, if you will, is like still intact. Okay. Um, because in America, you're never gonna get some raw majority of people who you know who who respond in healthy terms, like spiritually and ethically. I mean, to you know to to evil and overreach by officialdom. You're just not. It you've got mostly a nation, or not, yeah, you got mostly a country of natural slaves, and people who in spiritual terms are a bunch of frightened old women. I mean, it and I mean, again, like in pretty much every society, like I said, there's kind of like a mediocre middle, but I think it's characteristic of the late modern age more than it's not some universal constant. Like I don't believe that in Doric Athens, like that was the case. I know that in the Kingdom of Prussia things weren't like that, and um, I don't believe that like Napoleon and Cromwell and Muhammad, they certainly had quality human material to draw upon in relative terms.
So
There's
it's interesting you bring up natural slaves, right? Which there's a certain amount of Aristotle in that, right? But
Yeah,
to me, there's kind of one of the core lies of modernity, right? Is essentially that liberation will make men great, right? That, if we could just cast off the social bonds, kind of like cast off what you owe and what you're owed, like we will essentially transcend kind of like the limits of humanity, right? And I feel like what we've
yeah,
seen, especially in the 21st century, and likely just as well in the 20th, right, is that is fundamentally a lie, right? Like from a certain perspective, you and I have more options than almost any other person on the planet, right? Like you could, from a certain level, you could consume as much as you want. You could do things that you would have been thrown in jail for, even 35 years ago, right? With that next to no consequences, at least legal consequences, right? But at the same, we've created this population that's essentially stuck in this like bizarre public ritual of essentially having some like horrible figure dangled in front of your face, like Trump, Putin, Kyle Rittenhouse, and then being assured, like, oh, but you're safe. We've got you. Like the master essentially will protect you from the bad thing. And it's this weird, bizarre, like slavish ritual that you see just every 3 months repeat over and over again.
well, yeah, and that's why, like, that's one of the things that's. I mean, there's all kinds of dishonest. First of all, it makes no sense in this country how just arbitrarily, like, slavery is declared to be the most evil thing ever to exist. Yeah, that's like a totally random thing to focus on. Like that'd be like if 500 years from now, like some government in the Orient just like declaring that abortion on demand was the most evil thing ever to exist. Like, don't get me wrong, it is a moral evil, but it's like how random would that be? Is just to, like, focus on that. I mean, slavery precedes written language in the fossil record. It's like, oh, okay, that's one of a few like universal constants in human societies. But it's like the reason it endured is because again it is a natural state for a great many people. This wasn't Slavery was not this case of these kinds of like robust specimens like Spartacus, like being like shackled against their will, and like at every opportunity them trying to like break free of bondage. It was people where that was like their natural lot in part, not just owing to social conditions and accident of fate. Like they weren't capable of much else. I mean, like it. Well, and plus two, it's like what does America do with one of the most grotesque things about this country is that it's like obsessed with prison and like it. What does America do with a huge number of of its population descended from chattel slaves? It like locks them in prison. So it's like so these guys are better off in prison than they were as slaves. Like really like that. So it's not even as if the regime doesn't even live up to its own purported values in terms of what it attempts to take on in terms of remedial measures. I mean, not that it should not that such measures are necessary as in ethical terms, obviously, but you understand what I mean. So it's
It's that reminds me. So a mentor of mine who you two would have an interesting conversation because he's down his own revisionist rabbit hole, right? But I went to go visit him, and at the time he was living in a small town in Louisiana. And there's a place called Donaldville, Louisiana, which is in no way notable whatsoever. We were driving through Donaldville, and we look around, and he's talking, and it's very much kind of like the descendants of chattel slaves, right?
Yeah.
And he's saying like legitimately look at how these people live, right? The nice houses in town are old sharecropper houses, right?
Yeah.
Those are the nicest places in town. And he's like, look, like materially, are these people better off? And so my point is not like if you gave me said like, all right, well, would you sign on as a chattel slave? As ridiculous as that is as a concept, I wouldn't, right? So I'm not saying like I'd be the first in line, but you look at it and you're like, well, okay, like from a material perspective, like, is this better? And I'm not even getting into the moral conditions, because I would argue that those are like unarguably worse. But you look at that and like maybe Aristotle was right. Maybe there is just like a type of person who that is what they're kind of destined for, I guess.
Well, yeah, and that's why the ideal. I mean, that's the big contribution. I mean, I mean, I'm not a Nietzschean at all, but I think most of what's valuable in him was stuff that was stated better by Schopenhauer, but Ernst Jünger kind of perfected Nietzsche's idea of the sovereign individual who's neither master nor slave. I mean, that conceptually that's really important, especially for the white race. That should be the ideal in Hegelian terms. I mean, like that should be viewed as what we're doing is that's the ambition of our dialectic as well as of our concrete activity in everything we do, and make that point to people again and again. And obviously we won't be here to witness that, but what we do give to our descendants, in my opinion, includes in a very real sense our memory, and our racial memory. I mean, this pop. I don't want to get too esoteric and metaphysical, but that's why this pops up again and again in my science fiction series. Okay, because I very much believe in this, and for the record, I believe this will be increasingly substantiated by the scientific method as well too. But so my point is that even people who don't particularly have a strong historical sense, yet nonetheless realize the correctness of our position, you do perennially participate in history, before and after you're dead. Okay, in basic terms, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, historical existence is so fundamentally important. Okay, if you want to look at it that way, and then the preservation of historical existence.
So interesting you bring that up, because I think it was episode 16 of my show. I talked with a guy named Heroic Will, and he's a really interesting guy. He's a extremely knowledgeable kinesiologist, I believe, so exercise science. And he was basically saying that science has effectively got to that point with something as simple as kind of like your weight and your like physical capacity. That is both directly genetically linked in the sense that like, okay, well, if your dad's athletic, you're more likely to be athletic. But it's also linked on the level of essentially like the actions you particularly take. So for instance, right, it doesn't matter if you have the greatest genetics in the world. If you're a fat slob, your children are more likely to be a fat slob, even if they don't know you. So essentially kind of like the actions you take. And obviously, like, I'm not a materialist. I think science in a lot of situations is kind of like fake and boring. But the point is, that's a very kind of like technical, I guess, like a technical proof of what you just said. That is like materially true, at least according to this guy.
Yeah, epigenetic memory. And I want to write more about that in a dedicated capacity. But I came to it through thinkers like Carl Jung and Jaspers. I'm not any kind of Jungian, but there's some things that he was onto that people once dismissed as crankish or crazy, but that have been revealed to have real merit. I've got to wrap this up in the next few minutes. We can record again later this weekend though if you want to.
Sure thing, man. I had a great time
Yeah,
talking to you.
likewise.
So,
But is there anything you want to take up in closing?
no, not at all. If you could just briefly, give your plugs, where people can find you, and then we can wrap things up.
Yeah, certainly. Best place to find me, where you can find a lot of my long form essays, as well as the Mind Phaser podcast, which me and my comrades drop every 2 weeks. You can find that on Substack at realthomas777.substack.com. I behoove people to join our Telegram channel. We've got a very active Telegram channel. We got a great coterie of people there. We got about 4,000 people, and they're very active, and a lot of really, really bright guys, and a lot of young people, which is essential. Come the energy they bring, plus to the future. It's t.me/the7 HOMAS 777. You can also find me on Gab. I'm not super active there, but I back up pretty much all my content there. And like when I record with you or when I record with Pete Canones, who's a great friend of ours too, I always post a link to the video on there. And if you hit me up on Gab, I will respond. By DM, I mean, or whatever. You can find me on Gab, just at Real Thomas777. Our next project for the brand is I've got a YouTube channel. There's nothing uploaded there yet, but around mid-September, I'm going to start dropping original content there, and I also intend for it to be something of a one-stop sort of catalog of various friends of ours and comrades of ours and their work product. So be looking. If you want to join my YouTube channel, by all means join, but don't think like that it's a sham or something, because there's nothing there yet. There will be in right about 4 weeks, and that's just do a search on YouTube for Thomas777 in parentheses Thomas TV, and that's where we're at. And finally, the second volume of Steel Storm, my science fiction series, is dropping imminently. Please order through Imperium Press if you want to order a hard copy, because they're doing God's work, and they're dear friends of mine, and they're doing a lot of great things for our people and our movement. And plus I think Jeff Bezos has enough money. He doesn't need our money. Okay. And finally, in winter, through Imperium Press as well, I plan to drop my book on the Nuremberg World Order, and how international jurisprudence shapes political reality, and how the current world system was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the anti-fascist trials of the German Reich's leadership. That's all I got in terms of shilling.
Well, that sounds really interesting. And again, thank you so much for coming out, Thomas. I always enjoy our conversations. I can confirm that Thomas's Telegram is practically required reading. And I really enjoyed, this is a slight digression, but nonetheless, it was interesting hearing you talk to your friend Corey, right, about the Great War on Terror, because that was very much kind of like the beginning of my very, very early but political awakening. Like I remember, I think my first directly political memory is watching the invasion of Iraq on the news, and watching, Marines stack up sandbags and, vehicles burning in the desert. And so it was a great episode. I got a lot out of it. But anyway, Thomas, I don't want to keep you any longer. Thanks for coming out. I really enjoyed it. And as for my links, they're down in the description. You guys know where to find me. And remember, guys, life can't last forever. Thank you and good night.